You don't actually want love. You want relief. Relief from the quiet fear that if someone truly saw you, not the curated version, not the strong version, not the easy version, they might hesitate. They might slowly pull away. They might choose someone simpler. And that fear creates a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, not the kind that comes after a breakup or the slow drift away from old friends. This one is stranger than that. It happens when you are loved and still searching, when someone is holding you, and something inside you is still reaching, like you're almost home. But the door won't open. Most people assume this feeling means something is wrong with them. They don't. What it usually means is that they've been looking for union in the wrong direction, outward instead of inward, in another person instead of in themselves. Jung spent decades watching this pattern repeat across hundreds of lives. He saw people fall into relationships with an almost frantic energy, not because they were shallow or weak, but because they were doing something deeply human. They were trying to complete something, to find in another person the part of themselves they hadn't yet been able to hold. He had a word for this: projection, and he understood it not as a failure, but as a kind of unconscious intelligence. The psyche, he believed, always moves toward wholeness. Always. Even when it takes strange routes, even when it causes pain, even when it sends you into the arms of someone who mirrors your unresolved edges back to you, not to torture you, but to show you something you couldn't have seen alone. But here's the thing about projection that most people miss. It doesn't end when you recognize it. Recognition is just the beginning. The real work, the work that leads to what Jung eventually called the Sophia state, is the slow, often silent process of taking back what you've been placing outside yourself. Reclaiming the parts you gave away. Not from resentment, but from readiness. Soul union, in the Jungian sense, is not about finding your other half. It's about discovering that you were never split. There's an error that lives so deep inside most relationships that people rarely see it until years have passed. And even then, they tend to call it by the wrong name. They call it incompatibility, or falling out of love, or growing apart. But what it usually is, what Jung would have recognized almost immediately, is the moment when the projection fades. When the image you had of someone begins to separate from who they actually are, and the person standing in front of you, the real one, with their particular fears and blind spots and Tuesday morning moods, no longer carries the weight you needed them to carry. This is the moment most people leave, or shut down, or go looking for someone who will hold the projection again. But there is another possibility, a harder one and a quieter one. You can stay, not from fear, not from duty, but from curiosity. You can look at what just happened and ask a different kind of question. Not why did they change, but what was I actually looking for in them? That question, if you sit with it long enough without rushing toward an answer, begins to reveal something. There's a term Jung used that's worth knowing here: the contrasexual. In simplified terms, it refers to the unconscious dimension of the psyche that operates like an inner counterpart, what he called the anima in men and the animus in women, though the principle extends beyond gender. This inner figure carries the qualities the conscious self has underdeveloped. The tenderness a man learned to suppress, the assertiveness a woman was taught wasn't hers to have, the creativity that got buried under practicality, the vulnerability that felt too dangerous to show. When we meet someone who seems to embody those qualities, something electric happens. Not because they are extraordinary, though they may be, but because they're reflecting something of ours back to us, something we've been missing without fully knowing it. The error, then, is not in falling. The error is in believing that what you're feeling exists only in them. Because it doesn't. It lives in you. It always has. There's a particular moment that seems to happen on the path toward the Sophia state, and it doesn't look like an awakening. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a Tuesday. You wake up, you make coffee, maybe it's raining, and somewhere between the first sip and checking your phone, something is slightly different, not dramatically, not in a way you could easily explain, just quieter. Like a noise you'd been living with for so long, you stopped hearing it has finally stopped. The first sign of the Sophia state is that the inner argument slows down, not that it ends, at least not right away, but the quality of it changes. The voice that used to evaluate you constantly, the one always measuring whether you were enough, whether you were wanted, whether your worth was secure, that voice starts to lose its urgency. It's still there, but it doesn't have the same authority it once did. Most people, when this starts to happen, feel confused by it. Because for a long time, that inner noise was the main soundtrack of their relationships. The background hum of "Am I loved enough? Am I seen enough? Am I safe here?" It shaped how they entered a room, how they read a partner's silence, how they interpreted being left unread or not being touched on a particular night. It was exhausting. But it was also familiar. And familiarity, even when it hurts, feels like home. So when the noise begins to quiet, not through discipline, not through willpower, but through some kind of gradual interior settling, it can feel disorienting. Like you're not sure who you are without the searching. Jung would say this confusion is exactly right, that it means you're at the edge of something real, because what's happening in that quiet is not emptiness. It's the beginning of presence, not the kind you perform, not the kind you put on for someone who needs you to be calm, the kind that simply exists because you've stopped fighting your own interior weather, because you've started to recognize that the turbulence you've been trying to manage is not a flaw. It's been the most honest thing about you. The inner argument slows when you stop needing to win it. The second sign is subtler and more easily misread. You stop needing to be chosen in the same way. That sentence might sound simple. It might even sound like numbness, like you've given up or gotten cold or trained yourself not to care. But that's not what this is. Not even close. What changes is the source from which connection flows. For most people, especially those who haven't yet moved into the deeper layers of psychological integration, the experience of being loved is entangled with relief. There's an almost physical exhale that happens when someone chooses you, wants you, stays. And a corresponding contraction when they pull away, seem distracted, or don't offer what you needed. The love is real. But underneath it runs a current of anxiety that has nothing to do with the other person. It has to do with a question that never quite gets answered. Am I enough on my own? When you begin entering the Sophia state, that question doesn't disappear, but it stops driving. It starts to become something you can look at, rather than something that looks through you. And here's where something unexpected happens. Connection doesn't become less important, it becomes cleaner. You start to be able to love someone without the undertow, without the constant calculation of whether they love you back in exactly the right proportion, without the vigilance that turns closeness into something you're always managing. You can sit with another person and not need to track their emotional state for signs that you're still okay. You can receive care without immediately wondering how long it will last. You can offer something of yourself without immediately monitoring whether it was enough. This is what Jung pointed toward when he spoke of psychological individuation not as withdrawal from relationship, but as the precondition for real intimacy. Because the paradox, and it is a genuine paradox, is that you can only truly meet someone else when you are no longer trying to find yourself in them. The need to be chosen softens not because you've stopped wanting love, but because you've started to know yourself well enough that you don't require love to tell you who you are. The third sign is one that often goes unnoticed because it shows up in the texture of daily life, not in revelations. You start to tolerate ambiguity in other people, not just in dramatic situations, in the small ones, the ones that used to produce a subtle internal tightening. A friend who doesn't respond for 2 days. A partner who seems distant without saying why. A moment of disconnection in the middle of what was supposed to be a good evening. These used to activate something, a search for meaning, an interpretation, a quiet urgency to fix or understand or close the gap. Now there's more room. Not because you care less, but because you've started to understand something about the nature of other people that changes how you experience their mystery. You've begun to see, really see, not just intellectually accept, that other people have interior lives that are not about you. That sounds obvious, but it isn't. Not in practice. In practice, most people filter the behavior of those they love through the lens of their own significance. When someone is quiet, it means something about me. When someone pulls back, I am the reason. When something goes wrong in the relationship, the instinct is to locate the cause in myself, to make myself bigger in the story, even if what that means is making yourself guilty or afraid or deficient. Jung called this part of the individuation process the gradual withdrawal of what he named the participation mystique, the unconscious psychic fusion with others where you don't quite experience them as fully separate beings, where the boundary between their inner world and yours is blurred enough that their moods become your emotional weather. When that begins to dissolve, not through detachment but through the development of a more stable self, something surprising happens. You start to find other people more interesting, because they stop being extensions of your own story and start being genuinely other, genuinely unknown. And in that unknowingness, there's something alive. The fourth sign follows directly from this. You become curious about your own darkness without collapsing inside it. The parts of you that once felt shameful, the jealousy you couldn't justify, the resentment that showed up in relationships you wanted to be good, the neediness that contradicted the image of yourself as someone who was fine. Those parts stop functioning as evidence of your unworthiness. They become instead like messages. Not comfortable ones. Not the kind you welcome, but the kind that carry information. The kind that, if you're willing to stay with them, instead of immediately pushing them aside, start to reveal what they've been protecting all along. The capacity to be with your own shadow, to feel its weight without being consumed by it, changes the quality of every relationship you enter. Because you stop needing other people to hold only the bright parts of you. You stop needing to perform health in order to feel safe being close to someone. You can be, more honestly, what you are. The fifth sign is the one that most people find hardest to trust when they first notice it. Conflict stops feeling like a threat to love. For a long time, and for many people for decades, disagreement in close relationships carried a specific kind of weight. Not just the surface discomfort of not getting along, but something deeper. A subcutaneous alarm. A feeling that conflict meant something was fundamentally wrong, that the foundation was cracking, that love and tension couldn't coexist for long without one destroying the other. This belief runs deep, and it's almost always inherited before it's chosen. Children who grew up watching conflict erupt into abandonment learn that anger is dangerous. Children who grew up in homes where tension was always suppressed, where the peace was maintained by nobody saying the true thing, learn that honesty costs something. And so they become adults who either fight with desperation or appease with exhaustion, both trying to survive the same underlying fear. What neither learned, because it wasn't modeled, is that conflict, handled with some degree of care and honesty, is often the door through which two people become more genuinely known to each other. Jung spoke of the conjunctio, the alchemical image of opposites coming together, not as a harmonious merging, but as a tension that transforms both elements. Real union, in his understanding, was not the absence of difference. It was the willingness to hold difference without collapsing. When you begin entering the Sophia state, conflict changes texture. You can disagree with someone you love without immediately translating the disagreement into the question of whether you are still safe, still wanted, still okay. You can hear a hard thing without it dismantling you. You can say a hard thing without needing the other person to receive it perfectly in order for you to feel okay about having said it. This doesn't mean conflict becomes easy. It still takes something from you. It still requires courage and care. But it stops being the thing you organize your entire relational behavior around avoiding. And in that shift, something opens. Because when you can afford to be honest, when honesty no longer feels like a gamble with the relationship itself, the conversations that were always happening underground start to happen above it. The thing that was sitting between two people for months, unspoken, finally finds language. And in finding language, it often loses half its power. The sixth sign is perhaps the most difficult to name without making it sound smaller than it is. You start to love someone for who they are, rather than for what they resolve in you. This sounds like a standard thing to say, like something you'd find on a motivational poster. But what it actually describes is a shift in the architecture of how love works inside you. And it's not gentle, and it's not quick, and it doesn't happen because you decided to be a better person. It happens because you've done enough of the interior work that you no longer need a relationship to answer the fundamental questions about your worth. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that the love you offer has more room in it. Room for the other person's flaws, room for their changes, room for the possibility that they will, at some point, disappoint you, and that this will be survivable. Not because it won't hurt, but because your sense of yourself doesn't depend on them staying exactly as they were when you fell. This is what soul union actually means. Not the merging of two people into one. Not the discovery of someone who fits perfectly, who never triggers you, who makes everything easier. It means the meeting of two people who have each, imperfectly, gradually, sometimes painfully, begun the process of becoming more whole within themselves, and who choose, from that growing wholeness, to stay in contact with each other, to keep showing up, to keep being honest, to keep trying. There is something nobody tells you about this process. It doesn't end. The Sophia state is not a destination you reach and then maintain forever without effort. It's not a graduation. It's not even a stable plateau exactly. It's more like a way of inhabiting life, one that requires constant, subtle renewal. One that will be disrupted, regularly, by the ordinary difficulty of being human and in relationship with other humans. You will project again. You will fall back into old patterns. You will look at someone you love and, without meaning to, briefly see the reflection of something unresolved in yourself, rather than the person themselves. This is not failure. It's not evidence that the work was wasted. Jung believed the psyche spirals rather than climbs, that you return to the same themes, the same essential questions about worth and belonging and love, but each time from a slightly different altitude. Each return is not a regression. It's a refinement. What changes as you move further into this state is not that you stop encountering the difficult material. It's that you start to recognize it faster. You develop a kind of interior literacy. You feel the old contraction beginning, the familiar tightening, the start of the story that says, "I am not enough," or "they are leaving," or "this is too much." And you can pause. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than before. And in that pause, something becomes possible that wasn't before. Choice. Not the performance of being above your reactions. Not the spiritual bypass of pretending the feeling isn't there. Genuine choice, rooted in a self that is present enough and stable enough to respond rather than just react. This is what the Sophia state actually feels like from the inside. Not enlightened, not beyond ordinary pain, just present. More often, with less performance. With a growing capacity to be in contact with what's actually happening, in yourself and in the people you love, without needing to immediately fix it, escape it, or interpret it as evidence of your own inadequacy. The most human thing about this whole process is that it's never done in isolation. You don't become more whole by withdrawing from relationship. You become more whole inside relationship, through the friction, through the repair, through the 10,000 small moments where you choose honesty over comfort, or care over self-protection, or curiosity over the familiar story. You learn what you are made of by watching yourself in contact with another person. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you find that what you're made of is more than you thought. There's a particular quality that begins to emerge in people who have moved into this territory. It's not confidence exactly, and it's not peace exactly, though it contains elements of both. It's more like a quiet familiarity with themselves, an ease in their own company that extends naturally into their company with others. They don't fill silences the same way. They don't need to resolve every tension immediately. They can let something be unfinished, unresolved, uncertain, and remain present within that uncertainty rather than fleeing it. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He didn't say it would be fast. He didn't say it would be comfortable. He didn't say it would happen through insight alone, or through reading the right books, or through arriving at the right understanding in therapy. He said it was a privilege, meaning something rare. Something that most people pass by, not because they're incapable, but because it requires a willingness to be genuinely seen, first by yourself, and then, slowly, by someone else. Soul union, in the end, is not about finding the right person. It's about becoming someone who can receive love without immediately trying to outrun it. Someone who can offer love without disappearing into it. Someone who can be close without losing the thread back to themselves. That's not a relationship goal. It's a human one. And wherever you are in the process right now, whether you're at the beginning, disoriented and searching, or somewhere in the middle, catching glimpses of something steadier, the fact that you're asking these questions at all means something. It means the movement has already begun. You don't have to be anywhere other than where you are. The work doesn't require you to be further along. It just requires you to keep showing up to yourself, honestly, without the mask, and to trust that the wholeness you've been reaching for was never actually missing. It was only waiting for you to stop looking away.